There's still a few more people joining us, but it is 6 o'clock, so we can get started. So welcome everybody.
Hi.
And we are on our second episode of our Exodus series, the redemption of Israel. And we are now on the second Torah portion, VaEreh. And VaEreh begins at the second verse of chapter 6. And I'm going to be discussing those first few verses in the Torah portion, but I want to jump first before we get there. We're going to jump first to some of the later verses in that same chapter. Well, the beginning of the Torah portion actually begins with God speaking to Moses and setting forth the stage for him going again to Pharaoh, and now the real stuff begins. In this Torah portion, we have 7 of the 10 plagues are in this Torah portion. So we have ongoing interaction throughout the Torah portion between Moses and Aaron on the one hand and Pharaoh on the other hand. And so we start that process with the beginning of chapter 6 through verse 13. And then all of a sudden in verse 14, we have this very unusual kind of interruption. And it starts giving us a genealogy. Now, we had a genealogy at the very beginning of Exodus. That genealogy was very basic. It just gave us, the names of the children of Jacob. Now we're starting in again a little bit more detailed genealogy, and it starts with Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and when it gets to Levi, it gets through all the different genealogies until we end up with the family of Moses. And then the genealogy stops. Okay? So clearly that while this begins a genealogy, the point of this is not genealogy. Because if the point was genealogy, we would have the entire genealogy of all the tribes of Israel, at least to some representative members of each of these tribes who are now in Egypt. But no, it gets to Levi, gets to Moses' family, and it stops. And I'd like to take a look at some of this part here, because I think it's very, very instructive. So first of all, if you start with verse 16, when we get to Levi, it has the names of Levi, it has the sons of Levi, and then it goes on to Kehat. Kehat is one of the sons of Levi. Then we learn that one of the sons of Kehat is Amram, and then of course we learn that, Amram, of course, becomes a very important part of our story. Verse 20. Okay, Amram took to wife his father's sister, Yocheved, and she bore him Aaron and Moses, and the span of Amram's life was 137 years. It is only in this verse, in verse 20, that we first learn the names of the people that we already met back in chapter 2. So if we go back to chapter 2, and I think when we discussed this last week, I just kind of mentioned very, very quickly that was very interesting in this chapter, which is, of course, the story of the birth of Moses, is that nobody has a name except Moses, who gets his name, okay? But if you remember, go back to chapter 2, a certain man of the house of Levi took or married a daughter of Levi. And then we learn that they have a baby, and they hid the baby, and then the baby was they put the baby in the Nile, and the baby is rescued by the daughter of Pharaoh. Again, we don't have her name either, the daughter of Pharaoh. And at the end, she's the one who calls him Moses. So it's only after we get to here in chapter 6, verse 20, that we learn the name of Moses' parents, that we can figure out that the man of Levi, he was Amram, that the daughter of Levi who he married was Yocheved. And here it says that in verse 20, it says Yocheved is his aunt. Okay. Some people say it doesn't have to be his aunt, it might be his cousin, but whatever. They're clearly both from Levi. They're clearly both related. And this is when we first learn who the names of these anonymous individuals that we met in chapter 2. Okay. interestingly, we know the name of Amram, we know the name of Yocheved, and we have the name Moses and Aaron, who we've already met. We know that Moses' brother is Aaron, okay, and we've met him by name already now. We still don't know the name of the sister. That sister who in chapter 2 stood by the Nile to see what would happen with her baby brother. And actually, we only learn her name in chapter 15. Chapter 15 is after the whole story is over. Chapter 15 is the song of the sea, the song of Moses, where he sings praises to God. And at the end of that, we have in verse 20, then Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her and danced with tambourines. So, this is really the first time that we know who Miriam is. We know who she is as a person. We know she's the sister of Moses. And here we find out only at the end that her name is Miriam. So I think that is very, very interesting. And if I put that together with the interruption that we have here with genealogy, what is the essence of this genealogy then? The essence of this genealogy is to give us the names of people. And even though the point of this is probably to get to the genealogy and the actual names of Moses and Aaron, the parents, some of the uncles and aunts, the different people, what we have here, in contrast to what we have in chapter 2, is we have a list of people with names. Now, what happens to a people when they are slaves? Yes, I would like to repeat the comment that someone made. Please, everybody, can you mute yourselves until we call for, until we call, oh, here, I muted people. Let's see.
Please, thank you.
Okay, I'm muting everybody, because what happens is that we get the background noises when you're not muted. We will hopefully have a bit of time for a question and answer at the end, and then everyone can unmute. But for now, let's keep everyone muted so we don't hear your background noises. All right, anyway, we have the nation of Israel who are enslaved in Egypt. And one of the things that will characterize slaves in general, all over the world and always, is the lack of their own private identities. They don't have names. If they have names, they're very often names that are not used. In the United States, slaves were often given names at the convenience of the master. But typically, a slave without a name, a person without a name, you have stripped him with his dignity. You've stripped him of his identity. And there's a message here that's saying you as an individual don't count. And that's something, of course, we will often remember when we talk about the Holocaust and the terrible, terrible way the Jews were treated during the Holocaust. One of the first things that was done was their names were stripped. They became numbers, and Jews who were in the camps were tattooed, and they lost their names. They suddenly only had numbers. And so here, I think when we have in chapter 2 a description of these various events that are going on within a slave family. This is a family who don't have names, because at this point, the way they are treated and what their status is in Egypt, they are slaves. They don't have names. They don't have individual identities. And yet, at this point, and where does this happen, this point here? It happens right between God's final speaking to Moses and Aaron before the plagues begin. It's in between that, God speaking to them and them actually appearing before Moses, before Pharaoh. There's additional conversation between God and Moses in chapter 7, but it's all just more detail, what you're supposed to do, etc. And of course, starting in chapter 8, they go before Pharaoh, and we start this whole series of plagues. And actually, from the point at which Moses and Aaron go before Pharaoh and start the plagues, the people of Israel no longer play a role in any of this dialogue until the very end, until when they're getting ready, when they're doing the Passover sacrifice, and they're getting ready to leave Egypt. This whole in-between thing, the whole year-long time of this plagues, the dialogue is all between Moses and Aaron on one hand, between God and Moses and Aaron, between Moses and Aaron on one hand, and Pharaoh on the other. And so I think it's very interesting that these verses have come in here in chapter 6, before that whole drama of the plagues begins, as a way of saying, right now, the nation of Israel is about to be transformed from the nameless people that they were to a people with dignity, a people with a genealogy, a people with a heritage, a people who date themselves back to the original sons of Israel, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, etc. And so this I think has a very important role, these verses. It's not just genealogy, and it's not just to let us know the names of Moses' parents, but it is a way of saying there is a transformation going on, a transformation that is about redemption of people from slavery, who are going to go from these anonymous nobodies to people with names, people whose dignity is being restored. Now let's just take a look at the very end of this genealogy section. We have in verses 26 to 28. We got to the family of Moses and Aaron. We found out who they're married to. We found out who their parents are. And then we have this statement. It is the same Aaron and Moses to whom God spoke, saying, bring forth the Israelites from the land of Egypt, truth, and in all their truths. It was they who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to free the Israelites from the Egyptians. These are the same Moses and Aaron. For when the Lord spoke to Moses and the land in the land, it was on that day that the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt. What are we saying here? We've gotten to figure out who Moses and Aaron are. And then we're saying that this is the Moses and Aaron that God spoke to. And it's the Moses and Aaron who will then go and speak to Pharaoh. And what we're seeing here is that, first of all, Moses and Aaron, there's nothing royal about them. There's nothing unusual about them. The genealogy is rather ordinary. They have parents, they had sisters, they have brothers, whatever. Ordinary people who had ordinary children. And yet, then we find out it's the very same Moses and Aaron who are going to take the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. When you think of such an amazing feat that they accomplished, you would assume they must be super royalty. They must be something special in terms of their genealogy. And then we find out, no, they're just ordinary people. And not only are they ordinary people, these are the same people that we didn't even have names for in chapter 2 because they were slaves. And I think here the Bible makes an extremely strong statement. The Bible is anti-class, class structure, class hierarchy, royalty, aristocracy, noble blood. None of that is at all relevant to the Bible. It is not relevant to God. And in this way, the Bible is focusing our attention on the people who will be doing the most amazing things of all time. These two, Moses and Aaron, who are going to be taking a nation of slaves out of the greatest empire in the world at that time, who has enslaved them. They will be redeeming them. They are not nobility. Who are they? They are people that God has spoken to. And it's the only thing that makes them capable or that anoints them to be the people who will go to Pharaoh is the fact that they are the people to whom God spoke. And that is a message that we'll see throughout the Bible. It is not about who you were born to or what nobility or lineage you have. It is about what is your relationship with God. And we'll see that also later on. There is a sort of nobility that is created within the nation of Israel. We have, let's put the kings aside because the kings show up much later, and that is a bit of a controversial subject. If we ever study the book of Samuel, we can study that. But for now, what we have in the Bible, in these 5 books of Moses, we have a priestly class, so to speak. We have the sons of Aaron, who are part of the tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi themselves have some unique jobs as well, having to do with the temple. But within the tribe of Levi, or Levi, or Levi, or however you pronounce it, within that tribe, you have this one family, the children of Aaron, who become the priests, the Kohen, as the word is used today as well. And people, by the way, today within the Jewish nation, if their last name is Cohen or Kahan or Katz, there are a number of different surnames that people use. These people are usually a Kohen, and this is a genealogy that is kept within the Jewish people to this very day. If you go into a synagogue anywhere in the world, you will know who the Kohen is or who the Kohens are, because this is a tradition that hasn't been kept. So on the one hand, you could say, oh, wait, if the Bible is so anti-class, why do they have a priestly class? But even here, in the priestly class, which is coming from a family, the role of the priestly class is only to serve God. They don't get riches. In fact, they have less wealth than anybody else because they don't have their own land. And their whole goal, their whole being is only to serve God in the temple, to be the teachers of the children of Israel. This is the role they take later on. But I think there's a very, very powerful message that we hear in this as well. And if I would just go to the very last verse in the same chapter, but Moses says that Moses says to God, in Moses in verse 29, God says again to Moses, go talk to Pharaoh, go talk to Pharaoh, tell him what I'm going to tell you. And Moses once again protests, and what he says, Moses appealed to the Lord, saying, see, I have a speech impediment. How should Pharaoh listen to me? And that, in a way, comes to emphasize that Moses is not only is he not noble, he's not even articulate. Well, he will be enormously articulate, but this is how before God speaks to him and empowers him with the word of God, he is a man with a speech impediment, a man who has trouble expressing himself or articulating what he wants to say. And it's so anti this idea of class and nobility that even if today we have a certain level of that, and we're a much more democratic world that we were, but imagine in the ancient world at the time when the Bible was given, the Bible was written, and when these stories take place, it is absolutely revolutionary to see this kind of attitude. Anyway, now I want to go back to the very beginning of the Torah portion. It begins with God speaking to Moses and identifying himself. He says, God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am God. And he reminds him that he, the same God, appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, okay? And now he's going to say something that is very critical to the whole story. I also established my covenant with them, with the forefathers, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners, as temporary residents. I have now heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the Israelite people, I am the Lord. I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians. Well, let me stop here. I am the Lord, okay? Here, and this is really a message that God is saying to speak to the nation of Israel before he goes to Pharaoh, and he's telling them, I am going to rescue you from slavery. And he says two things. Number one, I hear your cries of suffering. But that's not why he is rescuing them. He's rescuing them here. He makes it very clear because he remembers his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that covenant was to give them the land of Canaan, what we know today is the land of Israel. So here we have a very, very strong message, okay, that Moses is here for, that God is basically saying, this whole story is a story that I set in motion. When I spoke to Abraham, 400 years ago, more than 400 years ago, I spoke to Abraham and I promised him the land. This goes back to Genesis 12. I promised him the land, okay? And later on in the covenant of the pieces, God says to Abraham, your children will be enslaved in a strange land, but then afterwards they will be redeemed. God now is coming at the other end of that promise. When the promise is ready to be fulfilled, and he is reminding Moses that this is all about fulfilling a covenant. The covenant with Abraham to give him the land, and the covenant of the pieces where he said they would be enslaved and then they would be released. So it's a very powerful statement, because very often the story of the Exodus and the story of the slavery in Egypt has been understood by many, a story of hope. Slaves can be redeemed. People suffer. They can turn to God and they can be saved. They can be helped. They can be healed. And clearly that is part of the story. But that is only part of the story, because the most amazing part of the story is that beyond the suffering of the nation of Israel, there is a covenant. And that covenant, God is committed to fulfill and to bring the people back to the land of Israel, to have them go in. After he says, I am the Lord, we then have 5 different expressions of redemption, okay? And I'll read them all to you now. Number 1, I will take you out from the suffering of Egypt. Number 2, I will save you from your bondage. Number 3, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with extraordinary judgment. Number 4, I will take you to be for me a nation, and I will be for you as God. Number 5, verse 8, I will bring you to the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, and I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. These are 5, what we call Jewish tradition took each of these 5 languages of salvation and redemption and refers to them as the 5 expressions of redemption. Now, on the night of Passover, we have a Seder, and that Seder is all about remembering the bondage in Egypt, the miracle of the Exodus from Egypt, and thanking God for this amazing miracle. Now, the Seder as we know it today is probably about 2,000 years old. It is there's a book, and there's traditions, and there's different passages that are read. Some of it's a little less than 2,000 years old, but it is a something that was created after the temple was destroyed, because when the temple was in existence, the focal point of the Passover was the Passover sacrifice. And the Jews would come in from all over the country, and they would go to the temple, and they would offer the Passover sacrifice. And some of the prayers that are in the Passover Seder Haggadah were also said then over the Passover sacrifice, but the whole way that we tell it today, a lot has been added. And one of the central pieces of a Seder is the cups, the 4 cups, okay? We have 4 cups that we drink, 4 cups of wine. Each cup is drunk. We have 4 different times during the Seder, 2 before the meal, 2 after the meal, that we drink these wines. Each drinking of the cup of wine is said with prayers and benedictions to God, thanking him for saving us. There is also a 5th cup, but it is not a cup we drink. In the middle of the Seder table, we take a big goblet, we fill it with wine, and that is considered to be the cup of Elijah the prophet. And there's a custom that in the middle of the Seder, we open the door and we welcome Elijah to come in. Now, Elijah, he's dead, he's gone, he went up to heaven, but there is a tradition that Elijah will come back, and it is Elijah who will be the one who will foretell the coming of Messiah. So this idea of welcoming Elijah into our Seder is very much tied up with the idea that we welcome God to bring us and redeem us from our current situation. Now, those 4 cups were considered to be parallel, actually the 5 cups, all 5 cups are considered to parallel these 5 different expressions of redemption, okay? The 4 cups we drink are parallel to the first 4 languages. I will take you out, I will save you, I will redeem you, and I will take you to be for me a nation. Those four. The first three all have to do with being redeemed from Egypt. The fourth is involved with us becoming the nation of God and refers to going to Sinai. The fact that we will then receive the 10 Commandments and officially be bound to God in this way. The fifth one is, I will bring you to the land that I promised your fathers. That fifth one is represented by the cup of Elijah. Now, all these centuries since the destruction of the temple, Jews gathered every single year and celebrated the Seder. And this high point of the Seder, these 4 cups of wine, and then the cup in the middle of the table when you open the door and welcome Elijah. In fact, as kids, we would always, we pictured Elijah as this ghost or something, spirit, I don't know what. And we pictured, Elijah coming in and he's going to sip the wine, and everybody would sit and look and say, oh, did he come? Did he have a sip of the wine? It was like, really exciting. But it was representing something so huge. This idea that we are waiting for Messiah. We are waiting for redemption. And in fact, we sing towards the end of the Seder, we sing the song, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim Habnuya. Next year, may we be in a rebuilt Jerusalem. Now, when I was a teenager, I went to Israel for the first time. And when I was 16. And people started going to Israel. I was born after the state of Israel was born. But in the early years, people didn't go to Israel. Some people moved to Israel. It wasn't that common. But as we got older and we started thinking about making Aliyah and moving to Israel, when we started singing Next Year in Jerusalem, we were not singing the same song that our forefathers sang. When they sang Next Year in Jerusalem, they were in incredible distress. They were in persecution. They were living in exile. The ability to go to Israel was impossible. And if they went to Israel, they were very often living there under more persecution than they were living wherever else they were living. It was an impossible situation. And yet every single year, the Jews would sing around their Seder table Next Year in Jerusalem because they really believed and hoped all these years. Well, it's not yet this year, but maybe next year redemption will come. And they held on to that last expression, promise of redemption. I will bring you to the land of your fathers. Well, of course, God already fulfilled that promise when he brought the nation of Israel into Israel under Joshua. But we took that promise with us into exile, saying that's a promise that it's not just about God's promise to fulfill it once. God is fulfilling that every time he pulled us into exile because he promised he would bring us back. Deuteronomy 30, for example, is a classic example of how even when you'll be spread to the 4 corners of the earth, God will restore you. God will bring you into the land. And Jews took this promise with them as symbolized by this, holding on to this last 5th promise and holding on to this fifth cup. And, it's today as we sit in Israel and we have our Seder, of course, we're still waiting for Messiah, and we all have lots of problems. There's problems in Israel, and there's problems in America, and there's problems in Europe, and everybody's got problems. And we're looking for Messiah, and we're looking for a time where we won't have war anymore, and where things will be good, and people live in peace and prosperity. But it's a different Next Year in Jerusalem than it was that my grandparents were saying, 50 or 100 years ago. It was a completely different thing. And, I just think about this whole idea of the hope that Jews have carried with them all these years, the hope, believing there's a statement of faith that we say, and that it's a song as well. I believe and with full faith in the coming of Messiah. And even if he may tarry, I believe I will wait for him every single day that he will come. It's that belief in redemption. It's that belief in Messiah that we took with us, even Jews in the worst times, Jews going into the gas chambers in Auschwitz would mumble this prayer, that even though they knew their end was coming, they still believed that God was going to bring Messiah and things would be better. Isn't it amazing that we live in the generation we do, that we are already seeing the beginning of the fulfillment of verse 8. I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. Amen. Okay, that's all for today. You can unmute yourselves if you want to make a comment, say anything. We're happy to spend a few more minutes if anybody wants to ask questions or say a comment.
Sondra, I have a question. My name is Norma. I've been listening to you. I love your class. But when you're talking about slavery, it made me wonder if that was the reason why they kept complaining through all the Exodus. 9 times they complain about different things. It's like they could not believe everything they had seen from God as real because they had been slaves for so long. Do you find a connection with that?
Absolutely. I think that this is one of the reasons when people say what was going on, why did the children of Israel have to wander in the desert for we may deal with this when we deal with the whole issue in Numbers about the sin of the spies, and then God says they have to wander in the desert. There's an understanding that maybe this is a generation that was not ready for that transition to complete independence in their own nation. They were not the people that were going to be ready to enter the land, conquer it. That was something that had to be left for a generation that was going to be born in freedom. But definitely so much of what you see partly in the book of Exodus, to a great extent in the book of Numbers, is people that have not been able, they have left Egypt physically, but to some extent they haven't been able to leave the slave mentality of Egypt behind. That's a wonderful, wonderful point, Norma. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Okay, anybody else have a question or a comment? Okay, well, thank you all so much. It was great seeing you, and I look forward to next Thursday, same time.
Hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.